Video game movies have been a thing for a while, unfortunately. From story-heavy films like Resident Evil to films that are based off IPs that have practically no story at all. By this point, y'all know where I'm leading to.
George? It's okay.
Are you familiar with genetic editing?
Yeah, I was just as stunned as you were. A movie based off Rampage, an arcade game where you play as one of 3 human-turned monsters who destroy city after city until eventually you run out of quarters to continue. That's it. Whatever slim, basic, non-existent story there is practically just a gamified version of King Kong or Godzilla, taking all the action and cutting out all the story. So how do you make a movie based off Rampage without having to stretch the source material? Well, you can't, unless you had a movie of 3 monsters just destroying cities for 2 hours. That's not as fun as it sounds. You're essentially creating a movie from scratch. So what's the movie going to be like? Probably crappy, probably going to rip off films like Jurassic World or Godzilla, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. Seeing the trailer filled me up with nostalgia. Rampage is a franchise that I hold strong sentiments to because it played such a big role in my childhood, which is probably why this movie is even getting made in the first place, to cash in on that nostalgia. I feel like I owe it to myself to go watch it. I also feel like I owe it to myself to make a video about Rampage now that it's relevant again. This is my Rampage personal retrospective. My first Rampage game was Rampage World Tour on Nintendo 64. I didn't know for many years that there was actually a prior game in the franchise simply titled Rampage. Released in 1986 in arcades, the game was eventually re-released on Midway Arcade Treasures, which is where I first discovered it. And I gotta say, it was pretty underwhelming. Future entries in the series had scrolling levels, not here. One screen, a couple buildings, you destroy them, move on, and repeat until you lose. To mix up the gameplay, behind windows, items could be found, but most of what they offered were either just points or just food that served as health. Nothing really special. Many of the appeals of this game were lost in my experience. Playing this game in the arcade meant that you had to pay quarters, and how long you played depended on how good you were and how many quarters you were willing to sink. On the compilation version, you pretty much get to play until you're bored of the game. There's unlimited continues. A high score isn't much of an accomplishment when you can just keep playing endlessly. The second big appeal of this game was playing with your friends. By the time this game was available on the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, you were hard-pressed to find friends who would want to play this with you. But back in the day, being able to play with 3 friends at the arcade at the same time was pretty neat. The game even encouraged players to join the action. Rampage was a game that you just picked up and played. Perfect for a laundromat when you want to kill an hour while your laundry finishes. But in my experience, if I somehow managed to find another person who wanted to play this game, it wouldn't last very long. Rampage loops indefinitely, and the game is only over when you feel like it's over. All this combined creates a rather pointless experience. Whenever I think of this game, I think of it fondly. It was exciting to see where the game came from, and the gameplay could be fun. It's fun to just unwind and destroy sometimes. Unfortunately, the game would be rendered obsolete by future entries. Before the future titles were released, Rampage was ported to multiple home consoles, one of which was the NES. Rampage on Nintendo is everything you'd expect except that it looks a lot worse and doesn't play quite as great as its arcade counterpart. The buildings just don't break the same way and it slows down the gameplay slightly, but noticeably. Whereas the original arcade version was 3 players, the NES is only 2 players, cutting out Ralph. The good thing about the NES port is that it actually ends at some point. After a certain amount of levels, you can see your progress in destroying the United States. This helps the game feel a little bit more than just a time waster because at least you know you're working towards a final goal. It's still a very long game that is extremely repetitive, but with an end in sight, it's almost like completing a marathon, a test of endurance and persistence. Both the arcade and the NES version don't hold much reason to be played today, but they definitely hold a special place in my heart. The second game released in the series, and my first Rampage game ever, was Rampage World Tour in 1997. The version I first played was the N64 version, which is practically identical to the arcade version minus some graphical simplifications plus technical downgrades, but having the ability to save given that you had a memory card pack for your controller. The game took the concept of the first Rampage game and expanded on it greatly. Rather than just taking place in the United States, the game now takes place all over the world, with one exception. Screens now scrolled, you can flap your arms to glide across buildings, new items were introduced, one of which turned your character into a super-powered bat for that one level. After World Tour was released, there really was no reason to ever go back to the first one. This isn't necessarily to say that the game didn't have any flaws. The game is still very repetitive. Despite the numerous additions, you'll have burned through them very quickly. It leaves you with a game with little to no variation throughout the whole experience. I remember being 9 years old and spending a hot summer day indoors muscling through this lengthy game. Unlike the first arcade game, it actually has an ending. After what feels like an eternity, you are given a final level on the moon, which leads into the ending. A pretty climactic way of ending this all off. It was just the right amount of simplistic presentation for me to consider this to be my favorite Rampage game ever. Yes, it's a repetitive mess, and getting through the arcade version is a nightmare considering you won't have any saves. Seriously, how did they expect you to beat a game this long that requires quarters to play? Perhaps the reason why I like this game so much is because of the nostalgia I hold on to. When I think of this game, I don't think of how long, repetitive it was, I think of how cool the characters looked, about how fun it was to destroy stuff, and how great the graphics looked back in the day. I can criticize this game all day, but at the end of it, I still enjoy it. But you want to know what I don't think of fondly anymore? The Game Boy Color version. I'll give it credit, the graphics were rather impressive considering that it was trying to emulate the 3D pre-rendered graphics of the arcade version, but it still looks like a mess. And the music, ugh. They also tweaked the gameplay. In the past, you could stand on the top of a building and just pound down on it, or you could destroy it from the sides. In the Game Boy Color port, all you can do is minimal damage from the top before you have to climb down to the sides and destroy enough to make the building collapse. That kills it for me because it makes an already repetitive game even more repetitive. It also never ends. Unlike the arcade version, the ending was scrapped. It looks like crap, plays like crap, sounds like crap. There is no reason to get this game. This game is a pile of dookie. Steer clear, folks. Nothing to see here. Rampage 2 Universal Tour, or 3 as it should actually be called, was the first game in the franchise to not be released in the arcades. Released on home consoles like N64 and PlayStation in 1999, Rampage 2 Universal Tour attempted to breathe new life into the franchise in a substantial way. Universal Tour introduces a handful of new monsters to select from, as well as some unlockables including the original characters. In World Tour, there was no real difference between the three characters. In the sequel, characters have different stats for running speed, climbing speed, and punching power, as well as a unique special move for each character that could be used after eating enough food. Also, lives have been introduced into the game, which means that you can lose permanently. No more continues. The game took the series forward in several aspects. Unfortunately, it also suffered from one key problem. It is still long and it is still repetitive. Even with all the additions, the game still comes down to destroying the same buildings over and over again. Playing each character is fun for 5 minutes, but after that, you've experienced all the game has to offer. To make matters worse, or at least I'm making a mistake, unlocked characters cannot be continued in the story that you've already started. Whenever you unlock a character, the game presents you with a code, but if you want to use this new character, you have to start the game all over again because when you save, it records which character you started off with. So if you've been playing for an hour and a half and finally unlocked a new monster you want to use, you gotta start it all over again if you want to see the ending. When I look back on this game, I don't really feel the same fondness as I did for World Tour. The game is just about the same, but the presentation just feels kind of bland. It's not as colorful as its predecessor, and I never really liked the character designs for any of them. Lizzie is the only one that looks kinda cool, but the rest suck in my opinion. The game does feel like it's bigger considering that you get to go into space in the later levels to destroy intergalactic civilizations, but it feels the same as destroying the buildings on Earth. It's not to say that I dislike this game, but I don't feel the same level of nostalgia I felt for World Tour, and that makes me never really want to revisit this title. And finally, the third game in the franchise, Rampage Through Time, will not be covered in this video. Why? Well, 1, I have never played this title, and 2, judging from the look of it, it's more or less the same as Universal Tour. The models seem to be the same, and of course the gameplay is the same. Moving on. The next game in the franchise tried to mix things up, and mix things up they did. Rampage Puzzle Attack on Game Boy Advance was released in 2001. Yeah, they made a puzzle game based off Rampage. A game that found popularity through mindless destruction has now been applied to a genre that requires using your mind. Interesting. Borrowing graphical designs from Universal Tour, Puzzle Attack is your basic block drop game. You gotta match up the colors and drop the shiny ones to make the matching colors disappear. You can make chains and you know the rest. It offered multiple modes to play, but nothing special, just your standard garbage, score, and puzzle variants like those that you'd find in similar puzzle games. Nothing all too special. Even the combo system is kind of off. I have found that simply pressing down repeatedly can get you long chains even if you do lose eventually. Even the combo system is kind of off. I have found that simply pressing down repeatedly can get you long chains, although you do lose eventually if you keep it up. It's actually kind of fitting that the puzzle game is pretty mindless at times, but where it worked to the benefit of the main series games, it doesn't really work well in a puzzle game, unfortunately. I give this one a hard pass. It's not as bad as World Tour on Game Boy, but at least that game was trying to emulate an arcade game on a portable system. The Game Boy Advance was a perfect system for an on-the-go puzzle game. This just wasn't a good idea. And finally, this brings me to the final game that I ever played, Rampage Total Destruction. Released on the GameCube and PlayStation 2 in 2006, Rampage Total Destruction seemed like it was going to be the best game in the series. I remember reading about this game in magazines and getting so excited about it. It looked massive, it boasted a massive cast of characters, it looked crazy, and it looked fun. And guess what? It really wasn't, no. You see, when a game is promoted in a magazine, there's not much a still image can tell you about gameplay. For example, I was excited because I thought you were going to be able to travel throughout a city destroying everything in your path. I was completely wrong. You see, stages are done in layers. So those buildings you see in the background, you can't destroy those until you destroy the buildings on the current layer. Yup, and to make matters even more disappointing, the stage is no longer scrolled. You are limited to 2 invisible walls, just like the original arcade game. When I first discovered this, I was pretty pissed. World Tour set the standard for what a Rampage game should play like. Why they would choose not to go forward is beyond me, but why they would choose to take a page off the old, outdated, obsolete arcade game is just dumb. It's dumb. This game is dumb. Being able to destroy a city all in one go would have been a great leap forward for a series that desperately needed it. The gameplay is the same as the other Rampage games. It's a repetitive button masher. They try to introduce some variety in the form of missions, eat 10 of this, destroy 5 of that, but it wasn't enough to really change the gameplay in any significant way. It's fun for a bit, but then it kinda just dies off. Needless to say, I never really played much of this one. I bought it, was disappointed, then kinda moved on. The massive cast of characters didn't do a whole lot for me. Many of them looked stupid and the charm of the original series was long gone by this point. My taste in gaming had evolved and going back to any of the previous games would be fueled purely by nostalgia. I would recommend this game if you're kind of interested in the series. The good thing is that it includes Rampage World Tour and the original arcade game as free unlockable games, so if you get this game and you don't enjoy it, at least you have the better ones. So that wraps up this Rampage personal retrospective. While it may sound like I dished out heavy criticism, the games were never meant to be more than just time wasters in the arcade. It was pretty ingenious, really. The gameplay was simple enough to entice younger players. Keeping score and seeing how long you could last attracted skill-based players. The cooperative nature of the game made it more user-friendly for those wanting to play in groups. With Rampage, players could work together to make it farther than ever, and if you were a player that enjoyed competitive arcade games, you can actually damage each other in Rampage. So there was a little bit of a versus element in this game. It had a little bit of everything for everyone, and growing up, I loved every little bit about it. Its cast was memorable as well as its presentation. I would recommend people pick up the Midway Arcade Treasures compilations, preferably 2, if any of these games seem to interest you, because you also get a selection of other great Midway Arcade titles. I hope the film adaptation turns out well and that it gets people interested in wanting to check out these old games. I doubt that the movie will make me feel the same way the games made me feel, considering that they have to stretch out the source material so much, but I'm curious to see how it turns out. Until next time, I'm Boyle.